Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Travel Council podcast. We're on this podcast forever represents our life, and when it's gone, so are we. My name is Ethan Kronk, and I'm joined by my co-host, Connor Boudreau. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, and today we are going to be talking about the 11th placers of the new era, which will kick off with Chanelle Howell. Ethan, would you like to recap how her game goes?
Yeah, so essentially, on her tribe, there are two duos, Mike and Jenny, and then Hi and Lydia. So Daniel and Chanelle, as the two remaining players, decide that they need to partner up as well. They end up finding themselves in a little sort of in the middle. They decide they want to side with Mike and Jenny, but unfortunately, Mike finds a beware advantage and loses his vote. Indefinitely, essentially. Chanelle then ends up going on a journey right after her tribe loses immunity. Her and Omer meet up. They're given a sort of prisoner's dilemma. Chanelle, for some reason, decides to risk her vote. She ends up losing it, and so now her alliance of four only has 2 votes, and this ends in a tie. Daniel doesn't want to go to Rocks. He sacrifices Jenny. While all this is happening, Daniel ends up throwing Chanelle under the bus. Chanelle ends up throwing Daniel under the bus. Coming out of it, they don't trust each other. Nobody on their tribe trusts either of them, and they go to a second tribal council where Chanelle is definitely a target, but Daniel is seen as maybe a little bit less trustworthy even, and is taken out, only for Chanelle to become the number 1 target by far at the merge. She's saved by the hourglass twist, and then the round following she is taken out, and that's essentially how her game goes.
Yeah, and some things that can really be added to that. At this vote, where she originally could potentially go out, there's the shot in the dark possibility. Chanelle ends up voting for Mike at one point. She constantly is just not really building back trust that was already kind of lost. And even though there are potentially, bigger threats, bigger targets, or even people that, are potentially less liked, she still ends up being the easy, simple option here, and there's really no question to the fact that she just doesn't play a very compelling or very overall well-rounded game.
No, she doesn't build trust with anyone other than Daniel, whose trust she loses pretty much immediately. She just makes herself a target, and an easy target at that. And at no point is she really calling the shots or, making any decisions. Maybe she could have had her and Mike not lost their votes and had it been just a normal tribal and they voted out Lydia. But at the end of the day, there's just something about the way that she played the game socially where I just didn't really see her building a lot of trust with anyone or forming super tight bonds with anybody on the tribe. She just seemed to have this really untrustworthy, maybe unfriendly vibe that people clearly didn't jive with, and it made for an unfortunate end to her game. But there just isn't much redeeming to look at when you look at her game, and the fact that she chose to risk her vote when she knew how vital her vote was and she knew how big of a risk she was taking in a prisoner's dilemma with only 2 people, it's just it was a baffling decision. It kicked off the entire course of events that would lead to her elimination, and it's just poor strategic play, poor social play, not much else to say. I almost feel like we don't need to talk about Cedrek, because we talked about him when we talked about Justin, we talked about him when we talked about Bianca, we talked about him when we talked about Say. It was just, Cedrek touched so many of the games of the people that went before him, and he did so in all the wrong ways. He just was the death nail for so many people, making baffling decision after baffling decision, to the point where it became a joke within the community. And it's been sort of a joke on this podcast talking about most of the Survivor 48 players, because Cedrek had a hand in a lot of their eliminations, but not in a way that makes him a good player, not in a way that makes him this dominant force who's in the driver's seat, controlling things and making moves, in a way where he's just like some sort of bad omen, where if you find yourself in a tribe with him, you're gonna go home to some inane bullshit. And it's just, he's an enigma. He's an enigma of a player. He seems like a great guy, but it's just difficult to justify most of the decisions that he makes throughout the game. But that being said, at 7th place, we have from Survivor 41, Tiffany Seely. Now, Tiffany is a player who I was surprised to see this low, just because when the season was airing, from an Edgic perspective, Tiffany was actually kind of a front runner for a little bit due to a few different factors, but at the end of the day, her game really wasn't that great. She does find herself in a majority alliance on the original Yasuo tribe, mainly consisting of herself, Evie, and Liana. They take out Abraham pretty easy as a consensus vote, and then that alliance sort of takes over, and the plan is to vote out Xander. Xander has Beware Advantage. Evie knows the Beware Advantage isn't active, but Tiffany just refuses to believe it in her paranoia, and it really doesn't make any sense. Evie is so clear about what she saw and how the advantage works that it's just obvious that Xander doesn't have a functioning idol or even a vote at that point, and yet Tiffany is so paranoid about this that instead of taking out Xander and flushing out a potential idol, they end up taking out Voce, which just isn't as much of a move. Then we see going into the merge, Yasa is sort of on the outs. They have to make a big play with Xander's idol and a fake idol to get around Liana, and who had flipped, and her knowledge is power advantage. Tiffany does play a role in that, but not really an instrumental one. She holds on to the idol, but it doesn't really seem like she's so involved in coming up with the plan. And then she's sort of taken out as a safe vote a little bit later on into the season, when they, are still concerned about Xander's idol and don't think that he would play his idol on Tiffany. It's just not a terribly impressive game from front to back, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean, there's not a ton that I can really add to that. Just to really kind of clarify really talk about just how much of a bad spot she puts herself in at certain points. If you go back to the journey, people were offset by her then. So even, let's say, situation's a little different, maybe there's an extra number or two. Down the road, it seems like people would have been off-put by her anyways. And again, her biggest move pretty much comes down to, the vote round with Xander and Voce, keeping Xander, helping him with the idol play kind of, but not really. So it's not like she made any big core moves, she just happened to have some okay numbers, which is definitely a step up from the first two players you mentioned. Our next player is Jeanine from Season 43. And Jeanine definitely has some similar issues to Tiffany in certain aspects, but we found quite a bit better in other ways. For example, at certain points in the game, Jeanine does have a pretty solid ally, but she, in terms of ally quantity, has a pretty minimal amount. I would say, honestly, that Dwight and Ellie are her only real two allies throughout the game, and they're at separate points, kind of forced upon each other to connect. For the Dwight one, I feel like they're both kind of out of the numbers. Her social awareness is also pretty awful throughout most of the game. And then, unfortunately, to top it all off, Jeanine gets an idol in the game that she unfortunately loses. Not out of the game, but she thinks goes out of the game when Dwight gets voted out. And then, not being aware that the idol's still in the game, has no way to really utilize that in a helpful way to what could have been save her had she, kept the idol, or maybe it not been, handed to Dwight, and maybe she handed it to someone else. But unfortunately, there's just not really much positive that we can say about the last few rounds that lead to Jeanine going.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at the end of the day, she plays a very similar game to Ellie, though maybe slightly better, which is funny because we do have her ranked a spot below where we had Ellie when we talked about the 13th placers, but I do think that this pool of players is better all around than the 13th placers. And number 5, we have from Survivor 46, we have Soda Thompson. Soda finds herself on the Nami tribe. She attempts to form a bond with Venus, and at first it works out, but then Venus's personality and general difficulty shines through, and Soda no longer wants to work with Venus, so she instead attempts to find a home with Hunter and Tevin. Unfortunately for Soda, Tevin immediately clocks her as a dangerous social player, which really ends up being Soda's downfall ultimately, is her lack of threat management, her just really out there brazen sociability where she doesn't do anything to try to conceal it or make it seem like she's not playing as much of a social game as she is. And Tevin just clocks her, and it doesn't bite her ass immediately. It doesn't even when they make the merge, she's able to last a couple of rounds, but ultimately, at the end of the day, Tevin makes his move on Soda, and she's sniped from the game in a split tribal situation, so...
One of the big things I would say that would separate Soda from a lot of the other players much lower down in this list is the fact that she does actually have a pretty solid social game for a large portion of it. Again, threat management, definitely an issue, but she does make connections with multiple people, and she's able to change those connections when it might fit her better or might suit her, gameplay a little bit better at parts. I would also say that unfortunately, just very, very exemplifiable just how poor her her gameplay management is for her threat level, with just how fast Tevin realizes that she's a threat. And I think that long term, maybe it wasn't necessarily the greatest move for all parties involved to get rid of Soda, but it's definitely something to consider with just how quickly her allies are willing to turn on her because of the threat she poses.
Yeah, and next up we have another player who mainly goes home due to poor threat level management. Do you want to tell the audience who that might be?
Yes, so for our number 4 player, we actually have Kaleb, who is someone that we actually had quite a bit higher when we were starting, and then slowly worked his way down this list. Unfortunately for him, he ends up being a superstar in the social game and absolutely runs his original Lulu tribe. Some people dubbed them the Lululemons, kind of fell in Kaleb's place, and anytime someone tried to target him, he had the connections necessary to stay further in the game. Given that it was a disaster tribe, it was already not a great situation going into the merge, but there is 2 opposing tribes that have fairly equal numbers and should really be looking to Kaleb and Emily to help break this tie. Unfortunately, due to Kaleb's gameplay, he unawareingly is the largest target for a little bit of time, and then is given the notion from Emily that he is in hot water. So what does he do? He pulls off the first successful shot in the dark in Survivor, which is a great moment for him. However, it's entirely by luck that he isn't the merge boot and actually moves up 2 placements on our list because of it. That being said, he's still an all-around solid player, but truly does suffer from his absolute lack of management for his threat level.
Yeah, and it really is that shot in the dark play that puts him a little bit lower on this list. Is just, had it not been for that 1 in 6 shot, he would have gone in Jay's spot, and we would have been talking about him 2 episodes ago. And that's just not a great look when we're ranking these players based on their placement. So, that being said, at number 3 we have from Survivor 44, Matt Blankinship. Matt starts off on the Ahsoka tribe. He immediately finds himself enamored with Franny. The 2 of them form a bit of a showmance, and this puts a bit of a target on their backs. Again, threat level management has been a pretty consistent theme for these last couple players, and it continues on with Matt because, well, I think his individual threat level isn't necessarily a super big problem for him. The threat of a partnership on Survivor is huge. People jump on that really quickly, and it almost doesn't hurt him too much. He's able to sort of find himself in the majority on Ahsoka when they choose to take out Claire. Mind you, he doesn't have his vote. Mind you, he doesn't have his vote because of a very stupid twist, so you can't really put too much blame on him for that. He continues to be in the majority when Ahsoka plans on taking out Josh if they end up going to another tribal, but at the end of the day, they don't end up going to another tribal. So we see Matt make the merge. We see Josh be an immediate target, he goes home, and then we see a split vote where Franny has a potential opportunity to save Matt if she wants to throw the challenge to Brandon and go to Tribal Council herself. She pretty easily has the numbers in that situation where Matt was very clearly screwed if he had to go to Tribal. I mean, there was definitely talks about voting out Jam Jam, but at the end of the day, voting out Matt just did seem like the most obvious answer for that group of people that was assembled. And at Tribal Council, he's not even able to play a Shot in the Dark due to the fact that he doesn't go back to the merge camp and isn't able to get his bag. Heidi kind of tries to use this control of vote advantage to save him, but it's not enough, and he ends up going home. And I feel like in a lot of ways he gets kind of unlucky. I do think he forms pretty good allyships, and ultimately when he does, so as far as he does make it, he isn't relying on Shot in the Dark plays. He isn't necessarily as much of a target as some of these other people. He's more of sort of just what was left for the opposing alliance to go after when the tribes were split up. So for those reasons, he ends up a little bit higher here, but...
And to kind of add on to a couple of those points, it truly is unfortunate that he can't manage the threat level of other players as much, that unfortunately it rubs off on him, because it was never really an ideal situation to be part of a seemingly showmance type relationship, and that was always going to, in the long run, hurt his threat level more so than ever come close to helping it. He also ultimately does lose the second vote because of something that is somewhat his fault. The first vote is a complete chance game, nothing you can do about it. Double or nothing, inherently risky, meaning he doesn't get to vote until the merge stage, and it makes it tough for people to really rely on you. So it doesn't really end up affecting his game too much there, but it is another unfortunate instance of chance kind of pushing people higher up this list, because how much can you blame Matt for not casting 2 votes at the 3 tribals he attends? At the number 2 spot, we ended up settling on Nate from Survivor 49. Our most recent season has a number 2 spot on this list, as Nate is a massive player in the Uli Alliance. The Uli group, at the time, a foursome that includes as well Rizzo, Savannah, and Shannon, is the power group in that tribe and ultimately has a ton of say. They don't need to end up using any of it, however, until swap stages occur, where in the first swap, Nate manages to stick together with 2 of his 3 fellow Ulis that are in that alliance, adds another person into the alliance in the form of Sophie, and things are looking great. In the second swap, however, things look potentially shaky. He's out of the numbers, but there's some people fighting in terms of alliances, so ultimately we'll never truly know what had happened to that tribal had he had to go, but again, it lasts for just a seldom round, and he manages to make it through. Then we get to the merge stage. Given that Nate is the last person here to make it to the merge chronologically, it's very interesting to see how that goes. All of a sudden, Steven takes, a couple people aside from his new bottoms up, and he goes, "We're still good, guys." Things fly out in his way, and Uli gets dunked on. Ultimately, Nate ends up being the person looked at as the figurehead, so his comfort in the game ends up being his own casualty, and he truly does have an unbelievable start, but it's completely potential and not realization, given just how quickly he ends up being voted out at the merge stage, and just, again, that alliance truly does suffer from potentially Savannah's threat level management, or I guess interaction for the other players. There's a couple ways you could put it, but Nate being the figurehead, the people that is the person who's looked at as the leader for Uli, that's the person who kind of ends up suffering from this.
Yeah, one more thing I want to highlight about Nate's game in terms of the positives are just a little thing when he goes on that journey, and he ends up sort of playing it out and finessing it so that neither him nor MC get an advantage. And I just thought the way he went about that was really smart. I thought he played that really well, and I just wanted to highlight that real quick before we moved on to our number 1 pick. And our number 1 pick is from Survivor 47. We have Sierra Wright. Now, Sierra probably starts off in one of the best positions on her original tribe. Not only does she have this alliance with the other women on her tribe in Rachel and Annika, she also has a really strong bond with Sam. She has pretty significant options, especially when John becomes a pretty consensus target at the first vote. She doesn't have to get any blood on her hands. She doesn't have to pick a side. That is until she goes to another tribal council, and she ends up siding with Sam and, funny enough, Andy in voting out Annika. Mainly just due to her trust in Sam. She sees him as her closest ally, and while she would have loved to work with the woman, she had to pick a side, and she ended up picking Sam. And I don't think it was a terrible move on her part by any means. And she still sort of gets to maintain a relationship with Rachel despite blindsiding her, so that's something that you can look at with Sierra and give her a lot of praise for. And then she makes the merge. Rome goes as a very obvious consensus boot. Tiana goes due to some weird, fucky twist with her whole original tribe ending up going to tribal council. But Sierra, you know, she has a game plan. She wants to try to take out the Takus, or the Tukus, rather, and work with the Lavos in order to do that. She does form some pretty decent bonds with the Lavos, and the Lavos seem to be liking Sierra quite a bit. However, as much as they like her, they see her and Sam as a massive threat. And again, it all boils down to threat level management for the, honestly, top 5 of this list, because it's really what ends up taking all 5 of them out. But with Sierra, I think it's a little bit less fair, considering, well, her and Sam were definitely a tight duo. I think this was exasperated by these showmance allegations that just were completely unfounded. They were completely baseless. And I do think she gets sort of dealt an unfair hand in that way. But at the end of the day, I just think she finds herself in the best pre-merge position of anyone on this list. I think post-merge, she is the most active in trying to put together a plan and put her game together in terms of how she wants to move forward. And all in all, I just think she is a pretty underrated player, all things considered, so.
Yeah, and something to really add to that as well, this can be said for Matt, Nate, and Sierra, but all 3 of them, the difference for why they were a little bit higher than some of the other players that were in that, you know, poor threat level management territory is it's not as much a fault of their own as it is fault of their allies. I think the big thing as well that sets Sierra apart is it was the threat management between her, like, power alliances, and she was also herself considered a big threat in the game at this point, whereas Nate was more a figurehead but wasn't necessarily looked at as the biggest threat of the Uli group. Matt, mostly just due to association with Franny and just, you know, situationally who was voted out, where Sierra, they specifically chose to target over other potential players, as well due to her own threat level management and the threat level management of her and her groupings of individual relationships and just overall strategic alliance play to pull the trigger on her over other players is, I think, what helped set her a little bit higher up on this list. That and just the, I'm going to say, potential I think Sierra had. Nate and Sierra, I think, had the biggest potential to go a lot further in the game, whereas I truly think that Nate didn't show as much effort to really branch out and make secondary connections at that merge stage in the same way that Sierra does. Sierra really goes out of her way to show that she can be a great social player and a great strategic player and trying to gain numbers, rally folks, and ultimately it ends up getting her voted out, but it's a very typical Survivor move, and it's a very logical move to do what she does.
Yeah, and she's taken out over Sam mainly due to her connection with Rachel, which, again, like, threat level management is a big thing, but to be voted out due to poor threat level management means that you had to play fairly well to become a big threat to begin with. And, you know, the fact that Sierra is the most connected person on that original Gada tribe by far. The fact that she continues to form connections with the merge, the fact that she, you know, her threat is sort of exasperated by something that I don't think was entirely in her control. I don't think was entirely fair in the whole showmance thing with Sam. For sure, I think Sierra was definitely the best 11th placer of the new era, and you know, we didn't initially have a ranked number one, but as we sort of talked through each player, we realized, like, Sierra really is quite a powerhouse as far as these early merge boots go. So, that being said, I think that's all there is really to say about these players. You know, we really enjoyed talking about this group. In the next episode, we'll talk about the 10th placers.
Alright, and don't be afraid to drop comments down below if you disagree with our opinions, or if you share the same opinions. We'd love to hear what you have to say about our rankings for these placements.
But for now, thank you all for watching. We hope you enjoyed, and the pod has spoken.